Last week, a friend of mine posted on Facebook a list of books that she thought white people should read because they're afraid to talk about race. And I thought about that for a while, and then I did respond because I'm not afraid to talk about race. I talk about race all the time, always have. But I know from colleagues, I know from friends that many of them are afraid to talk about race. But they're not afraid to talk about race so much because it's uncomfortable. They're afraid to talk about race because they know that if they take a view that differs from the progressive mindset, they're going to be called a racist. They may get in trouble. They may lose their jobs. I mean, there have been people who've been in the news lately who voiced a different opinion about Black Lives Matter and who are calls out for them to be fired. And people know where you live. They end up protesting not outside your office, maybe outside your house. Maybe you threaten your family. So people are afraid to talk about race, and for good reason, because you can't deviate from the norm. It's not as if you just have a different opinion. If you have a different opinion, you're going to get in trouble. So I thought what I might do is start a series of videos. I can't do everything in one video to talk about race from a personal perspective. And this is the first video, and we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll do more, maybe I won't. I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From first grade to 12th grade, I went to Catholic schools. And during those years, all I ever learned was if you worked hard, you could get ahead. You could certainly do better than your parents. Maybe you could do a lot more. I mean, when I was in school, when I was becoming, somewhat aware, it was some of the first things I remember was the Kennedy election. Catholic school, it was a big deal. A Catholic was running for president. My God, a Catholic was elected as president. I mean, that was really something. And I remember that. I remember the nuns, the priests, my parents, my grandparents all say, you work hard, you go to school, you'll get ahead. You'll do better than we did. And that's pretty much the attitude I got out of school with. At no time did I hear anything other than that. Little comments here or there or something, but nothing big, nothing that as I embarked on my adult life after graduating high school, made me feel concerned about what my future might hold. And then I got to college, and I was taking a U.S. history course, and I learned that there had been problems in Philadelphia before the American Civil War. That there had been a big anti-Catholic riot, that militia units had dueled in the streets. A couple dozen people died. Churches were burned down. I think a convent was either they tried to burn it down or it was burned down. I mean, this was a big deal. And it sort of took me aback that here I was in college, and only now am I learning that there was anti-Catholic sentiment in this country. I mean, I really hadn't been aware of it. I'd grown up without knowing anything about that. And then I got my PhD and I started teaching. And I was teaching in the 1990s in North Carolina. And a question had come up about lynching. And a student, I won't go into all the details, a white student had sort of tried to play it down a little bit by looking at the total number, dividing it by the number of years and saying, it really wasn't as bad as it seemed. And I, said, no, you're missing the point. One person is lynched, blah, blah, blah. But I thought, I should get some different numbers, some new facts that maybe will jar these kids into realizing just what a terrible thing lynching was. And there were, it was sort of not too early in the internet, but I had a computer at home and I could get online. So I went and I searched for the biggest mass lynching in U.S. history. And I thought I'd get some numbers that, this horrible day somewhere probably in the South, all these black men were lynched off trees. And when the results came up, I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. Why? What was the biggest mass lynching in U.S. history? The biggest mass lynching in U.S. history happened in 1891 in New Orleans. 11 men were lynched, killed, murdered. Not only without a trial, they had been tried and found not guilty, and then they were lynched. So it was even worse than people just being denied due process. They had received due process, been found not guilty, and then got lynched. And who were these people? There were 11 Italian Americans. There were 11 Sicilians. And I am actually Sicilian. The family name was Palermo. It was changed to Palmer. And my grandfather, I once asked him why they changed it. And he said, I thought he was joking. He said to pass for white. But after I started reading about what had happened in New Orleans, this was back in my grandfather's youth, I said, maybe he wasn't joking. And I should add just in passing, I don't really know what our family name is. Just like if you think of The Godfather, Vito Andolini comes from to the U.S. and he came from the town of Corleone, so he gets the name Corleone. He doesn't get the name Vito Andolini, he becomes Vito Corleone. My grandfather got off a boat from Palermo. He may have been from Palermo. His name was probably Giovanni whatever. We don't know what his name was. And he got the name Palermo and later changed it to Palmer. So I don't even know what my family name really is. But anyway, I'm sitting here looking at this and I couldn't believe it. That the biggest mass lynching in the United States were 11 Sicilians. And then I read a little further down, this is before I moved to Tampa, and there had been two Sicilians were lynched in, I think, 1913 in Tampa, Florida. This wasn't like some sort of random occurrence happening here. I mean, this happened frequently. And there were obvious questions I had. But the biggest question I had was, how come I didn't know anything about this? I go to Catholic school for 12 years in Philadelphia. Nobody ever mentioned it to us. Most of the kids were, many of the kids were Italian. I'm not saying the majority were. We had Irish and Czechs and English and Poles and Germans, you name it. But there were a lot of Italian kids. A lot of the nuns and the priests were Italian. My aunt was a nun. She was Italian. And they never told us about any of this. I hadn't learned about the anti-Catholic riots in Philadelphia. I hadn't been taught about what happened to Sicilians being lynched. I didn't. Why was that? And then I started thinking about another question. Would I have been better off if I had known about that? Would I have progressed as well as I did if I had known? I mean, I ended up with a PhD. I became a full professor, chair of my department, published 10 books, did all the right things. You can look back and say, well, I had a fairly successful career. But it was hard. I mean, getting my PhD, my father didn't get out of high school. My mother didn't really work. None of them were professionals. My father was a professional cop. But, most of the kids I went to school with, families or parents were academics, they were lawyers, doctors. They all had more money than me. I had to work my way through school. I worked in a factory when I was an undergraduate. Even when I was in graduate school, between the time I spent as a TA and a graduate assistant, and I was working on the side when I wasn't supposed to be. I was working like over 50 hours a week and going to school full time. And it was hard. And, half the people I went to school with never finished. I was lucky to finish. And I thought, would I have done all this if I thought the whole world was stacked against me, or people were gunning for Catholics or Sicilians, or, and I'd never had any of those problems, but, I didn't even look Italian. People always thought I was Irish. I had green eyes, and I wasn't particularly dark, unless if I get in the sun in the summer, I'll get really dark. But I hadn't had any problems. But would I have done better, or would I have done worse if I'd gotten out of school thinking, that I was likely to be victimized in a country that reeked of anti-Catholicism and anti-Sicilian feeling. Would I have done better if back in grade school, every year we had an annual Linciati memorial? We would read the names of Linciati and say little prayers for them. Maybe we could all dress in Italian folk costumes and dance Italian folk dances and fly Italian flags and do all these things in memory of the Linciati, with the prayers led by the priests and the nuns and very solemn. And, we could have little assignments to do little biographies of the Linciati, and we knew all their names, and we would make little stick figures with little Italian folk costumes or something, or whatever. The guy was a peddler, a fruit peddler, so we'd make a little, stick figure with a guy with a little fruit cart, pushing little pieces of fruit around. Why wasn't that done? And if it had been done, would I have accomplished as much as I did? Would I have gone as far, or would I have gone less far? Now, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's a question. And I think it's worth asking. My own personal view is, considering how hard it was to get where I ended up, had I had these additional burdens laid on me, thinking that, every time something happened, maybe it had something to do with this, or maybe there was, anti-Catholic feeling or sentiment. Maybe I didn't get a job because I put down in my religion I was Roman Catholic. I don't think I would have done as well. And I think it would have made me look over my shoulder more than I did. And that led me to another question. And again, I don't have the answer. It's beyond me, but I have an observation. I can think about it. It's a free country, at least so far. What about the way we educate other children in this country? Not just African American children, I mean all children. All the schools today teach victimization. You're Latino, you're victimized, you're Native American, you're Asian, you're whatever. Everybody's always taught about what a terrible place this has been for minorities. And one can make I teach the history, I teach the same things in college. But if you drum it into kids' heads when they're very young, what's the impact of that? How do people think? What do they see? I mean, again, as I said before, if I had been raised on annual pilgrimages to sites of little statues and memorial statues of Linciati, would I have done as well as I did? Would I have seen anti-Catholic, anti-Sicilian, anti-Italian sentiment everywhere I went? Especially if the name hadn't been changed. If I was Mike Palermo, what would have happened? Which could, I mean, I had relatives. Not all the brothers changed their names. I had relatives named Palermo. They're pretty obviously Sicilian. I mean, what would have happened? And there was an incident once that I witnessed, which I thought sort of related to this. It was back in the 90s in Greenville, North Carolina. And I grew up in Philly. I loved cheesesteaks. And there was a place up on Greenville Boulevard, it was called Big Apple Pizza. It's no longer there. It's something else now. And they had fairly decent, for south of the Mason-Dixon line, cheesesteaks. So I took my son up there, I think it was a Saturday, probably around opening time for them, around 11. We were first people there. And we ordered 2 cheesesteaks and 2 Cokes. And we got our Cokes and we sat down. And I sat down where you had the front where the guy was who waited on you, and then you went down, and back there was the grill. And I'd been there before, so I knew how it was laid out. And I wanted to watch the grill guy because I liked watching grill guys. When I was a kid, I had a part-time job once working a grill, and I liked watching the guys with the spatulas and the salt shakers, and how smooth they were and how quick they were and how they did it, because I had done it myself. So I sat down where we could see the guy, and the grill man was this young black guy, probably in his early to mid 20s, and he was making our cheesesteak. right after we sat down, uh, black man came in with a kid. And the kid was about my son's age. The guy was probably 10 to 12, 15 years younger than me. He was much younger. And he sat down like two tables away from us, but he couldn't see who was making the steaks on the grill. And then shortly after that, two young white guys came in, probably college students. They weren't, they were certainly that age. And they each ordered two slices of pizza and some sort of soda. So they got their sodas and they sat down, and the guy in the front, opened the oven and threw four slices of pizza in the oven to heat up. I mean, pizza had been made beforehand, and not from the day before. That morning, they made fresh pizza, but you still needed to get it hot. So they, pulled the slices out, threw them in the oven. Now, obviously, it takes less time to reheat a slice of pizza than it does to cook from scratch a cheesesteak. We got to cook the steaks, cook the onions, cook the peppers, and throw the cheese on and get it all together. So not surprisingly, the first thing's done with the slices. So the kid at the counter was another white guy. Says, slices up, and one of the white guys walked over, picked up the four slices, took them back to the table. Meanwhile, the grill man is working on four cheesesteaks now, and I'm watching him. And all of a sudden, I hear the black adult who walked in with the kid after me. He starts yelling, starts accusing the guy of being a racist, the counter kid, who's maybe 22 max. And he's like, he doesn't know what the hell's going on here. He says, what'd I do? What'd I do? The guy says, I came in before those two white kids. They got their food before me. You served the white man before you served me and my son. Now I'm sitting there with my son, and I'm still waiting on my food, and I was the first one in there. And of course, the guy on the grill, who looked like he was pretty new and didn't know a lot of what he was doing, yeah, he's black, but he doesn't know that. And the kid on the counter says, it only takes like 90 seconds to heat up a piece of pizza. The guy in the back's grilling your steak. It takes a little bit longer. But the guy would have none of it. He was just insistent that this was white preference, white privilege. These kids got their pizza, and of course these two kids are like, they don't know what to say. And the guy, meanwhile, the little kid, the black kid with the father, starts crying. Now, I don't know if he's crying because he's upset because his father's upset. I don't know if he's upset because he's been victimized by racism, or maybe he's upset because he thinks he's not going to get his cheesesteak. I have no idea what this kid's thinking. He's maybe my son's age. Maybe they were 9 or 10. And suddenly the father grabs the kid by the arm, jerks him out of his chair, and cursing and screaming at the kid. This is racism, and he's going to report it to the NAACP or some shit. I don't know what went on. And he drags the kid out of there screaming and crying. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, first off, anybody, I don't care what color you are, you ought to know that it takes longer to cook up a sandwich, a hot sandwich, than it does to reheat a piece of pizza. I mean, that's A. B, he knows I was there before him, and I'm waiting for my food. So, I wasn't served first. I wasn't served before these kids. So that doesn't fit the narrative either. And then, third, it's just he obviously has somewhere along the line, maybe he's experienced a lot of racism, or maybe this is what he's taught, or a combination of the two. He's convinced that he didn't get his cheesesteak before these white kids got their pizza because of racism in this country. And he leaves. And I thought, what's that little kid going to think? What's the lesson he learned this morning? I explained to my son what had happened, how the guy didn't understand what was going on. I pointed out, look down there, who's making the steak that this guy's complaining about not getting quickly enough? And so my son wouldn't draw, improper conclusions from any of this. But I thought, what's this kid going to think? He doesn't know that the grill man was black. He's only a 10-year-old. He may not understand that it takes more time to cook a steak than it does to reheat a piece of pizza. And what's the impact going to be on him? Is he going to see everything like this? Is he going to be, turn out like his father, where everything that happens to him is going to be racial? It's going to be related to racism in this country? And I'm sure along the way, this kid, like all Black Americans, face racist incidents. They may not get jobs because they're Black, or something else may happen to them. But it's bad enough for what it is. Do you need to make it worse? I mean, on top of actual racism, do you need to suffer from perceived non-racism? I mean, are we doing kids a favor by teaching them that they're likely to be victims their entire lives? And again, based on my own experience and thinking back to what I found out, after the fact about what had happened to Catholics and to Sicilians in this country, I mean, my conclusion was I was probably better served by not knowing. Because when I got out of school, I thought, the sky was the limit. Maybe someday I could be like John Kennedy and could be president. I didn't think like, oh, I never make it to be president because I'm a Catholic or because I'm Sicilian or whatever. I don't know that we're really doing kids a service by educating them like this. But I could be wrong. You may have a different opinion, and that's fine. This is just, my view from not just what I've seen, but also what I've personally experienced. Now, let me make this clear. I do not in any way mean to equate the problems Sicilian Americans or Catholic Americans have had in this country compared to African Americans. I mean, we're not even in the same ballpark here. We're not even in the same league, to use another sports analogy. And I understand that, and I fully appreciate that. But I think the educational principles are the same. If it would have been a mistake to drill into my head constantly the history of anti-Catholicism in this country, the history of anti-Sicilian sentiment. The biggest mass lynching in the United States were Sicilians, not Blacks, not African Americans, Sicilians. We were lynched. Now again, not as many Italian Americans were lynched as African Americans by any means. That's why I said we're not in the same ballpark. But that's still the question I'm raising is, are we doing kids a favor to raise them in this mentality of victimhood? Or are we perpetuating this? Will these kids grow up to be like that guy I ran into in the steak pizza shop, who, when anything goes wrong, immediately sees it through the prism of race, whether it is racist, related to racism, or not? And that's a real question. And if you have an opinion, leave a comment. And if you do leave a comment, or you don't leave a comment, give me a thumbs up. Subscription would be appreciated, and hit that notification bell so you know when I come out with new lectures. And until I do,